We are recording. So for folks who aren't joining us, we'll have an opportunity maybe to see this again. Donna, I'll compress this file and get it to you some way, somehow. I guess the folks who are going to see this after this recording starts missed that 15-minute intro, but that's okay. Okay, so yeah, as a bit of a review of last time, what we talked about last time was really a few themes. Finding resiliency and hope in the time of chaos. That was the sort of the theme of our workshop. We talked a lot about anxiety and grief and loss. And one of the things you'll remember is that we spent a lot of time normalizing the anxiety that you have. It's your body's normal response to an unusual event. Some might not say unexpected event. A lot of us would probably say it's unexpected, but remember what I said about philosophically about unexpected things last time, that it's in our DNA to be able to respond and be resilient to unexpected things. So depending on your philosophical orientation to chaos, right? Because chaos is a part of the human experience. If our philosophical orientation is, oh my gosh, chaos, get it away, we can't deal with it, hair on fire, what are we going to do? Then unexpected events are really going to unsettle us. They're really going to make us wobbly. Versus if our narrative is, wow, that was unexpected. I mean, it's okay to acknowledge that, certainly. But then to shift to a place of self-protection, which might sound something like this: how am I going to deal with it? Right? How am I going to deal with it? That language is language of resiliency. That's how we figure out how to roll our sleeves up, put our work boots on, jump in the trench, and start making it better. And that relates also to grief and loss. Grief and loss also comes when we deal with chaos. And you recall when we talked about grief and loss, you know, there's a couple different models out there, but for a quick model, you could look at it like there's a period of disorganization, there's a period of transition, then there's a period of reorganization, okay? And when we mobilize a response to respond to these unexpected events, it gives us a sense of empowerment. It helps us discharge the charge that our body carries when we experience traumatic things, and that's really good for us. I'll talk about that a little bit more later today. And then we can get to a place of life enhancement. And that philosophical orientation that I talked about last time, that's what this rebirth looks for. Am I going to speaker view? Is that better for everybody if I go to speaker view? Sorry, okay. Of course, we're normalizing anxiety, right? It's your body's normal response to unexpected events. And the grief and loss that you feel that with unexpected events, it should also be normalized. If you didn't feel some sense of anxiety with chaotic events that have come with COVID-19, then you'd be a bit of a piece of cardboard or an alien or something like that. Like your anxiety is you know, a sign that your nervous system is working. We're also going to talk about that nervous system a little bit more today in terms of how we self-protect. I've been giving quite a few of these workshops, so forgive me if I repeat myself from that session last time. But I think I got it pretty square. Does anyone remember what the two things are that really add to our anxiety from our session last week? Please feel free to type it in there, or maybe unmute and feel free to share. What were the two factors that actually makes our anxiety much worse than it actually is? Yes, I see an answer there from someone. Negative narrative. So yes, that's one of the things that actually make our anxiety quite a bit worse. And someone else has added avoidant behavior. So number one, if we have a negative narrative, it's going to, and there's some really cool brain science with our narratives. And I should back up a little bit, because sometimes our narratives are influenced by our past trauma. They're influenced by things like our family of origin. But the brain science is pretty neat about this is that when we um, over myelinate a neural pathway in the brain, it grows just like a muscle. And when that pathway grows, let's say it's a negative pathway or glass is half empty pathway, our thought patterns tend to get stuck in a rut. Okay, so that's a bit of the bad news of the way the brain works. The good news about the way the brain works is that we have control and choice over what narrative we create. So, so the choice is ours around being mindful about what narrative we create. Now, um, the brain has this sort of use it or lose it rule about it. So if we have a negative narrative, which is firmly entrenched, which comes from our family of origin, which comes from our historical trauma, which comes from our individual trauma, um, you know, some tough stuff about that is that the brain gets pretty fixed. It's definitely hard to change that narrative sometimes. But it is doable. The brain is plastic enough to do it. We call this neuroplasticity. Probably lots of you have probably heard that term by now. And so if we're really deliberate and purposeful about coming up with a positive narrative or an adaptive narrative, or how can I approach this differently narrative, then that's going to myelinate a new neural pathway. And that's the neural pathway that we want to grow. Just like a muscle, that neural pathway grows. And again, with that use it or lose it rule, hopefully the negative way of thinking, the negative outlook tends to die off. And that's what happens with the neurons in our brain. They tend to die off. Like, I'm really bad at speaking French. So my apologies to the French speaking people out there, because I just didn't practice it after high school. And as a result, those neural pathways kind of dwindled off. On the other hand, I'm quite good at Spanish because my dad retired down there, and I like going down there to surf, and I love the language and the food and the culture. And so those neurons are quite well myelinated, and my Spanish is pretty strong. So that's kind of how our brain works with this narrative piece. And so your homework was really around, from last week, was really around being deliberate and purposeful about choosing your narrative, so not to add anxiety on top of already existing anxiety. Now, some of the themes Donna shared with me are things like mom guilt, right? Having to work and parent and teach and perhaps cook and clean or whatever it is that you're having to do work-wise inside the home and outside the home. And Donna mentioned loneliness and isolation and this sort of generalized overall anxiety that we're kind of hit with. And we're going to talk about some of those themes a little bit more today. But we really want to manage our narrative about those circumstances. And yes, the person who shared, I guess it's live to everyone, Caitlin shared, avoidance behavior. So when we avoid, and we tend to avoid things that we feel vulnerable around. And how do we avoid them? We tend to numb. And lots of times that numbing is really unconscious. Last time I used my example of my hand in the chocolate chip bag at night. Usually after all my chores are done and everyone's asleep and it's just Greg watching Netflix, eating bonbons, right? And so that's a way we numb. And Greg can do that really unconsciously. And next thing you know, he's 5 handfuls in. And so numbing, and so my little hot tip that I shared with you last time was that I've learned to ask myself this question after a couple handfuls. Sure, a couple handfuls, no big deal, but it's when it's just habitual and it's just mindless. I ask myself this question, which is, Greg, what are you numbing from? What are you numbing from? And I usually know the answer to that quite quickly. And so when you're conscious enough to, I guess, have that reflective question, that insightful question, it forces you to confront what you're avoiding, right? And so, and I could keep shoving bonbons in my mouth if I wanted to, perhaps, or I could turn toward that thing I'm avoiding, which usually has something to do with having a conversation with my perfect partner. So I'll head upstairs and have a conversation. And I tend to feel a lot better after that. And that's that empowerment coming up. And I tend to not have to eat anymore because it's time for bed. Do you know what I mean? I don't need to be blindly, unconsciously shoving food in my mouth. So managing that narrative, avoiding avoidant behavior. These are going to be really important skill sets, I think, for you all as you manage all of your stresses relative to the current workplace predicament and your client stresses and your family stresses. So I really invite you to pop up any questions. You can ask them privately to me in the chat room there, or you could ask them, to the group, and we can talk about that a little bit more. Now, when negative stuff happens to us, I'm going to talk about the nervous system now and its response to, I like to say, novelty. Like when I'm working with clients, I say, our nervous system's response to novelty. Because sometimes our nervous system is going to have a response to positive things. Well, certainly it is, or it's going to have a response to unexpected things, and it's certainly going to have a response to traumatic things. But I guess my point is that I'm not just talking about trauma here, but when unexpected kind of things jump out at us, it creates a charge in the nervous system. I want you to think of that charge as like electrical charge. And as it turns out, having too much of that charge pulsing through our nervous system is wildly not good for us. Although it does kind of kickstart us into some self-protective response. If we don't activate or actuate that self-protective response appropriately, that charge tends to get stuck in the nervous system. Or if we pick the wrong response to self-protect in the wrong moment, then that charge tends to get stuck in the nervous system. And there's a couple analogies I use to define that. Did I use that analogy last time with you all around the deer in the forest and the cougar? Give me a thumbs up. I see some heads shaking. Okay, so I won't go through that in-depth analogy again, but I will share a bit of research with you though. In the 60s, there was a terrible bus crash in Northern California, and a handful of children perished. A handful of children lived. The bus driver died. And what happened was these children who survived, there was a handful of them, a small handful of them, that actively participated in saving themselves and saving everybody else, kicking windows out, hauling out these frozen individuals that were really like starstruck with the tragedy that just happened. And so these people who really fought to basically save their backsides, got everyone out, got them up the bank, waved down a car, got help, etc. Now, what happened was some social psychologists started studying those people longitudinally, and what they found was quite remarkable. And so that longitudinally, they studied them over time. And so what they found was those people that were frozen and didn't have a self-protective, action, tended to have lower education, higher incarceration, drug and alcohol addiction, and some mental health stuff. Those who actually participated in saving their backsides had fairly high socioeconomic status, high education, no mental health, no incarceration, low drug and alcohol dependency issues. So this was remarkable to these psychologists and the social psychologists. And the argument is made about this particular research study that when you actively participate in self-protection, no matter what it is, well, we got to cook dinner tonight, or I got to kick this window out because the bus is sinking in some lake. When you actually participate in finding order in that chaos, that alone discharges the majority of the charge that our nervous system is dealing with. Okay, and that is a huge takeaway for you in terms of being an active participant in your chaotic life, right? And everyone's got chaos in their lives. And one of the beautiful things, I guess, about COVID-19 is that we're all in this together, aren't we? And so we can all really relate to one another, I think, a little bit better. And so we all have this charge and chaos in our life now, and no one's Instagram life is perfect, right? And so we know that by now. And so, so we're carrying this charge, and what can we do to activate a self-protective response such that we can discharge this charge off our nervous system too? There's a couple of good questions coming in, and I'll get to these. Is there much science around meditation, the benefits, mindfulness? Yes, lots of science around it, lots of benefits. We're going to talk about that when we get to self-care a little bit later. And I always like to say, you know, the 5,000-year-old Ayurvedic practice of yoga can't be wrong, right? So there is a lot of science behind that. Okay, so I'm getting distracted here. So back to that nervous system. So when unexpected novel events happen to our nervous system, we have this charge. We have to find functional ways of discharging that energy. Of course, when we work to self-protect, that's a healthy way to discharge that charge. We don't always have that luxury. I'll give you a good example of that from the research is car crashes. Car crashes are a good example of you cannot fight or flee that thing. All you can do is brace while you look at that car skidding at you, right? And so car crashes tend to be one of the most complex forms of trauma. And there's a number of other complex forms of trauma too. I'll avoid listing them all, but think things where you're trapped. Think things where you cannot remove yourself from impending doom. That it creates a level of trauma that we tend to call complex trauma. And so it's a little bit more tricky finding ways to healthfully discharge with complex trauma. So if we can't discharge in the moment, I think one of our jobs to take care of ourselves or our clients is to find ways to discharge after. Another little interesting bit of research comes from, actually, you may have heard of this gentleman, Peter Levine. So he's kind of the guru behind somatic experiencing, which is a specialty designation that I have, and it actually forms the real foundation of my private practice. And so in I can't remember, maybe it was the 1980s when he was coming up with this theory. He got in a car crash himself, and it was a fairly bad one. But he crawled his way out of the car, and guess what he did while he was thinking through this theory? The other person was okay; they were doing their thing. He starts doing these sort of faux karate kicks and air punches. And yelling and screaming and like kicking the car. And I guess people were thinking this guy was having a psychotic episode. And eventually, after a few minutes, he tired himself out and sat down. And a few people tried to come up to him, and he couldn't tolerate them coming into his space because that charge was flowing in his nervous system after this car crash. And then eventually, this very caring person who happened to be a nurse, she came down by him and eventually helped connect with him and rubbed his back and asked him if he was okay. And anyway, long story short is he physically found a way to discharge that energy after the event as a bit of an experiment to see if that would help him feel better after the event. And evidently, reportedly, it did. And the second key piece there, which relates to something we talked about at length last time, things that give us hope in the time of chaotic events, is human connection. Human connection is profoundly healing, right? Okay, I'm getting off track. So getting back to what I was talking about in terms of the charge in the nervous system, and finding functional ways to discharge, and really being deliberate and purposeful on your end to find ways. Maybe you can't discharge how you're feeling at work because you have to contain yourself a little bit, but how could you do it after work? Broadly speaking, we could discharge mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. Do know that the first two ways of sort of connecting with discharge, either mentally or physically, tend to be the easiest ones for us to connect with. And I think of an earlier version of myself. I would just go to the physical all the time. I would be running like crazy, be riding my bike like crazy. I just never stop. And there's a degree to which that felt really good, but there's also a degree to which that's just Greg numbing himself. What's Greg running from, right? And so have a little bit of self-inquiry around your movement and your mental piece, because those two might not be doing it for you, and you need to add the spiritual and the emotional. Okay, so spiritual is more around connecting with something that's bigger than you as an individual. Okay, something that's bigger than you as an individual. Community, could be church, could be your family, could be a snowflake on your glove, could be watching the salmon spawn. And I, for one, find connecting with nature a great way to do that. And then lastly, emotional discharge, right? Of course, I'm going to say this because I'm a talk therapist, but coming to see a talk therapist and verbally getting it off your chest, that's a form of discharge. I don't think any good rock and roll or punk rock music was made without the artist discharging the words on the sheet, right? Or one of the best novels that you've ever read, or a good screenplay. Those kind of things come from people's discharge, right? So I invite you to be a bit of a detective around how do you healthfully discharge? How do you unhealthfully discharge? Because of course we'd like to raise our level of awareness of that. Remember Greg and the chocolate chip bag? Remember Greg of old, where you'd go for a 6-hour bike ride, right? That's unhealthy, right? Perhaps it's just numbing pain. It's just another way to flog yourself, perhaps to numb pain. So raising our level of awareness with how we discharge, and then trying to find functional ways to do that. Now, this is really important. If we don't find functional ways to discharge, guess what happens to the nervous system? It finds dysfunctional ways to do it for you. And this is what that looks like: depression, anxiety, addictions, anger management, things like irritable bowel syndrome or fibromyalgia, or those kind of things that reside in our digestion, elimination tract, the scientists somehow can't figure out. Well, finally, we're putting a bunch of research into understanding that it's actually cellular change in the nervous system that comes from being stuck in this baseline of stress. Now, I want to talk a little bit about that. So that baseline of stress, we got a name for that in nervous system language, and that name is hypervigilance. So we want to try to avoid feelings of hypervigilance. Now, you guys are certainly going to be experiencing that phenomenon with your clients. You're probably, experienced it in your own lives to a greater or lesser degree. And I think COVID adds this to our reality, actually, because now with something like COVID, something that affects all of us, we've got this background static electricity kind of charging us in the background, reminding us that we've got something to fear, right? We've got something to be worried about. And that's essentially, again, it's anxiety is your nervous system's self-protective response, and it's trying to kickstart you into how do we self-protect. Remember the 3 ways to do that, right? You could fight functionally, you could flee, or you can freeze. All 3 are good, but us humans, we have this terrible, not terrible, but we have this sort of trait of ours where we get stuck in habitual response patterns. Those tend to come from our family of origins and our own past traumas. And kind of the brain science behind that, which is pretty cool, is that the brain scientists think that there was a time when that way of responding worked for us, and the brain remembers that, and then unfortunately gets stuck in that because it thinks that's its go-to every single time. So there was some prominent event that happened in your life or your client's life where that mechanism helped you. It's either fighting, either fleeing, or either freezing. And you remember that, and then you default to it all the time. But unfortunately, remember that deer and cougar analogy I used last time, is the deer is much better at that than we are as humans, partially because it's got a sloped brain and no big prefrontal neocortex. That's our problem. We think it out too much. What if only, should have, potentially, well, maybe, and all these variables that we can see tend to get us frozen. So this state of hypervigilance is not good for us. And COVID is kind of creating that for us on many levels, right? Our household economies, our work, our kids, our jobs, our bills, our debt, our loved ones, our aging parents, for those of us in the middle-age category. you know, our compromised selves, our compromised friends and family. So that's creating this baseline stress and maybe kickstarts us into this place of hypervigilance. Big takeaway for you is we want to avoid that hypervigilance. By the way, in that nature example, hypervigilant animals simply don't survive. They're too exhausted to find a partner to mate with, to find food, to sleep. Of course, they wouldn't sleep because they're worried that something's going to eat them. So they just keep moving, and they eventually get plucked off. And in fact, from maybe a survival of the fittest sort of lens, is they just evolutionarily didn't make it, right? And so the ones who make it are the ones that can adapt. The ones who make it are the ones that don't stay stuck in hypervigilance. Now, this is really important if you're kind of taking some notes. What's the opposite of hypervigilance? So the nervous system language for that, we call it relaxed alertness. Relaxed alertness. So the nervous system is relaxed enough that it can take a big, deep belly breath, okay? That it can ground its feet, that it can close its eyes. Perhaps you've seen a dog or a cat do that, and just be at peace. And what does at peace mean for us as humans? It means two things. Number one, it means we're safe, okay? And number two, and safe is fairly straightforward, you know, one hopes. But the second thing isn't as straightforward, and it's I'm worthy of love and belonging. Okay? Safe, I'm worthy of love and belonging. Those are basically the two things that any nervous system needs. That's the two constructs that we want to raise our kids by. That's what we want to create for our kids. That's what we want to create for ourselves. And I think what's important about that is it's up to us to create that. I think a lot of the clients I work with are really, especially young adults and youth, they're really desperate for external validation for that worthiness, right? And that tends to make young people really powerless and kind of victims. And I've really seen this stick with people beyond young adulthood too, where they're really desperate to get their validation from external validators. And so we want to raise our kids feeling that sense of worthiness in and of themselves. And for us, we want to cultivate our sense of worthiness in and of ourselves, right? That's a place of empowerment. That's not being a victim. That's, you know, making a choice with how, you know, what your image is or self-image is of yourself. So we've got hypervigilance on this one side of the continuum to be avoided, and we've got this state of relaxed alertness on the other side of the continuum. So again, alert enough to know, hey, what was that twig breaking over there? How do I respond to that? And you know, remember that last week I called that the WTF moment, the moment where you're kind of deciding. Well, the nervous system language for that is orientation. Is you're orienting to your environment to determine WTF, right? And so what do animals use to orient? They use their sense of touch, sense of taste, sense of smell, sense of hearing, sense of sight. And guess what? We have those five senses too. And arguably, maybe some of them aren't as developed as an animal's, like, you know, like those intuition, those vibratory kind of senses. But I have learned, this didn't come to me naturally, this was a learned thing for me, that lots of people are quite intuitive. And so some people might have that guttural kind of response to the twig breaking, and that gut needs to be trusted. That gut needs to be trusted. The gut's known as your second brain for a reason, because it has an intuitive knowledge base in terms of how to self-protect. So my point in highlighting that we have those same senses as an animal has is that's how we know an animal orients. We got to orient the same way. So when we hear a proverbial twig break, and what's a twig break? I don't know. It's our partner yelling at us. It's our kids freaking out. It's our you know, teacher telling us we're not doing enough to support our kids at home. It's oh my gosh, is my program going to be funded next year? Like, those are the kind of things that would create novelty for us, that would create a tension and charge in the nervous system. And so we're going to orient to that with our senses, right? So we're going to look at it. We're going to hear about it. We're going to feel it. We're going to talk about it. We're going to sense it deeply to get an understanding about it. And then we're going to enact a self-protective response. We're not going to freeze for too long, right? Freeze is okay to orient and figure out WTF, but you don't want to get stuck there too long, because that's when you become lunch. At some point you have to orient to flee or to functionally fight, right? Not dysfunctionally fight. Functional fight means making requests to get your needs met. Functional fight means speaking your truth. And above all, what we're not going to do is numb away from that thing that's creating novelty for us. Okay. Okay, so I was talking about worthiness there, and I got a great question. Practical tips for fostering self-worth. So this is a great question, and I love the practicality part of it. Yeah, you know, and I might say a few things that sound hippy-dippy a little bit, and maybe to you they don't feel too practical, but I do challenge everybody to give it a try. So there's a number of things that come to mind about practical tips to foster self-worth. And one is around a narrative, okay? The story we tell ourselves. Of course, this narrative could be a mantra. It could be a storybook or a journal that you write. It could be that rock and roll or punk rock song, or a novel for that matter. But you need to create a narrative of deep love and acceptance of self. Okay, and it might sound like this, and this is the hippy-dippy stuff, okay? I, Greg McDonnell, am worthy of love and belonging. Feels weird to say that to 38 people right now. But that's what this is about, I guess, is having the courage to say it to yourself in the mirror. Right? And if you were to try that exercise, it might feel really inauthentic at first. It might feel really weird. Your partner might think, hey, what are you talking to yourself in the bathroom for? Right? Interesting little exercise. But how would that feel? I've practiced that with clients in my office many, many times, y'all, where they can't even say those words. They can't even say those words, or they force them out and then the emotion comes. And that gives me an insight on where their neural pathway is locked. It's actually on a shame narrative and a I'm not worthy narrative. And so we need that old narrative to die off in the neural pathway, and we need to somehow carve out a new neural pathway. I really believe it starts with deeply loving and accepting oneself. Another way you could do this, I think this is quite practical, is through imagery, right? Maybe lying in bed, going asleep. Everyone know what yoga nidra is? Yoga nidra is a form of yoga. It's the easiest part, I think, because it's the end of yoga when you're in that just lie down pose, right? They call it corpse pose, or they call it shavasana. And in fact, if you go to YouTube, oh yeah, this is my symbol for YouTube. My 10-year-old's been bugging me because he says Zoom has made me more of a hand talker. So if you go to YouTube and you type in yoga nidra, there's a number of videos there. I wish maybe I could put a link in here, but because there's a bunch that are kind of junky, or they're like an hour and a half long. If you scroll down, there's one with a picture of a candle and a lily pad. It's kind of a close-up, candle and a lily pad, candles inside the lily pad. And it's about 14 minutes long, and it's a guided meditation, and it's about creating an intention. And so with this self-worth piece, create an intention of deep love and acceptance of self. And do the yoga nidra exercise, which is profoundly relaxing, right? And so it's a mindfulness exercise. It's about belly breathing. It's about being a witness to thoughts that come and go. And of course, it's guided, so it helps us stay on track, as opposed to just us being usurped by this monkey mind of ours that's going every which way but sideways. Right? The other piece around cultivating that self-worth might be around celebrating your successes, really taking time to acknowledge, and maybe even letting people around you celebrate you a little bit. But I think that starts with you, and giving yourself permission to celebrate something that you did really well today. I think we have a high degree of shame narrative right now. And of course, all y'all must be familiar with the work of Bren Brown. She's done some fabulous work in the realm of vulnerability and shame. I reread her stuff all the time. She's got a new podcast out. I'm just consuming that all the time. And I invite you all to dig into that, because she's constantly talking about the theme of self-worth. So one of the weird things that's going on in our society today, and maybe this is part of the reset button that COVID creates, because I think we'd all agree the way the world was working, it was kind of careening toward a cliff there a little bit. But maybe part of this reset button is sort of that. Well, sorry, the way the world was going before was that there was a lot of shame out there for us. And we have to look a certain way, and we have to have so many followers on Instagram, and we have to get so many likes, and we have to have our hair just right, and we have to have dinner on the table, and we have to be sexually available, and we have to whatever, right? All those bullshit things, excuse my French, that society sort of expects of us. It seems to me that society has created this baseline shame that we can't live up to, right? And just give me one sec. Where is this person? Oh, there we go. Got it. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, and there's someone also chiming in. We were in the chat column there around meditations that are free and available in Squamish right now. And yeah, another good question about list of resources. Maybe I'll compile a little list of resources. Also, I've been part of a really exciting thing recently called the Sea to Sky Healing Project. And I invite you to check that website out. And it's a bit of a work in progress, but it's meant to be a bit of a funnel and a filter for a bunch of great resources. It's not totally exhaustive. It's not perfect, but check it out. There's a bunch of resources there, and I'll try to put together a number of resources for Donna as well. If you're interested in some of this nervous system language stuff that I'm talking about, and this is the work of Peter Levine and of course somatic experiencing, you could check out a book called there's one called Trauma Proofing Our Kids. That's by Peter Levine. And another one called Waking the Tiger. Okay, Waking the Tiger. So it talks about some of these concepts around hypervigilance, relaxed alertness, charge in the nervous system, finding ways to functionally discharge, really honoring and acknowledging body sensations. I think, as we caregive for ourselves, I don't think we're very good at sort of honoring and acknowledging body sensations. Those body sensations is our nervous system waving a red flag saying something like this: Greg, it's time to do something about what you feel right now. And too often, and I'm guilty of this, and it happens to me every day, y'all, where I'm sitting in my chair of my counseling office and I say something to my client that I realize that I'm not doing myself. That happens to me every single day in my office, right? So I'm doing the best I can with what I got, and I know y'all are doing the best you can with what you've got too. So when you have that feeling in your gut that says, hey, I just told a client to do this healthy thing, you might challenge yourself to try to do it as well, okay? Um, yeah, thanks. There's a few people that have to dip out early. No problem. Thanks for joining us thus far. Um, okay, I think I distracted myself there and I got off track. What were we talking about? We were talking about um, charging the self-worth. Right, right. Practical ways to find self-worth. And I got distracted on the idea of imagery and sort of creating a particular image of yourself. And it doesn't have to be this ripped body, looking good on the beach type person. Make it something that's really authentic for you. If it's something you're good at culturally, or in the kitchen, or parenting wise, or with your kids, find a way to celebrate that. Again, our shame narrative, the way society has us poised, is so strong that we don't do that enough. So give yourself permission to celebrate those successes. Okay. All right. We talked about, we're still in our review. Wow. Hopefully you're finding this useful. Switching from anxiety and this nervous system stuff, I want to just give you that quick review of grief and loss. So we talked about the real quick model of grief and loss, where we've got this period of disorganization based on this event that we're faced with, this trauma, perhaps. We go into a place of transition. And I think firmly that we're in that now with COVID. We're entering into the stage 2, and we're opening things back up, and we're doubling our bubble, and we're going back to work, hopefully in some way. And maybe our kids are going back to school. And so we're easing back into life. The tortoise is sort of poking its head out to see if it's safe to do so. And this transition is really good for us. And I invite you all to participate in that transition, because that's going to help you discharge. And then we move into a place of reorganization. Okay. And I have a bit more to say about that, but I just want to acknowledge this comment here that I think is public for everybody, from Cheryl. Oh yeah, Annie Martinello. I remember her from the old Whistler days. I haven't seen her for years. It looks like she's still doing some yoga in Squamish now, and it's still happening. So let's try to connect with that. And the thing, there's two kinds of yoga, everybody. There's this sort of power-oriented yoga, and then there's a very restful, relaxing arm of yoga, otherwise known as hatha yoga. That's the type of yoga that I would recommend for all you lovely caregivers. I already know you're a powerhouse, so you don't need to go out and do some power yoga. What you need is more relaxing, meditative, restorative yoga. And it sounds like there's people offering that down there in Squamish. Okay, so the other piece I just wanted to just remind you of relative to this grief and loss stuff is, there's a couple of important things, but the main one is giving yourself permission for your survival skills to drop off after a traumatic event. That's normal. That's your body's normal response to abnormal events. Okay. But we can't stay stuck there for too long. And that's where that avoidant behavior comes up. I'm working with some people through this parent-infant loss program, and those are tough clients. And I love working with them because I love mobilizing them towards some sort of life enhancement. But I'm working with I have historically worked with some that have a really hard time, and that's complex trauma. Let me tell you, and many of you probably know this. And so sometimes we become a bit avoidant, and we're like, I'm not going to engage in society a little bit. And for those people, life tends to shrink a little bit, and that doesn't get us through transition and reorganization with grief and loss. That keeps us frozen. And we know what happens there if you're the deer in the forest, right? So we need to activate, we need to mobilize. So that means turning towards your vulnerabilities. So for these clients, it means getting out of the house. It means self-care. It means going shopping. It means literally, it means re-engaging with life. And so the thing with the nervous system, I should really comment on this, is that if we expose it to too much too soon, boom, that's going to be way too activating for the nervous system. So you want to, the sciencey language we use for it is titrate. You want to titrate those exposures. You could call it exposure therapy too. And that what titrate means essentially is you expose your nervous system to it bit by bit. So you don't want to overexpose your nervous system to things that are too triggering. So for instance, for you all, if you're really triggered by the thought about returning to the Sea to Sky offices, if you were my client, I'd be working with you by saying, okay, what can we do to gradually, so this is exposure therapy, what can we do to gradually expose your nervous system to it bit by bit, such that we can really highlight the empowerment that comes away from a little bit of exposure. And it might start with not even going in the building, but just driving down the street, 2nd Avenue, right? Just driving down the street. And so drive down the street and notice the sensations in the body. Notice how your body responds to it. What's your narrative? Hey, I'm looking forward to going in that building tomorrow. Or, negative narrative, which I'm not even going to say, but like you could have a negative narrative, which is of course to be avoided. We want the positive narrative. Gradually exposing yourself a little bit more, maybe the next day or that evening, you actually park the car where you normally park and you walk by the front door. You don't go in, you walk by the front door. The nervous system is going to feel some activation. It's going to feel some response to that. But my hope is with that positive narrative, you also feel a great deal of empowerment and that sensation of, oh yeah, that was no problem. I can do more tomorrow. And in fact, tomorrow you do more. You end up walking through the front door and you realize, hey, this isn't so bad. And so gradual exposure to things that you would expose yourself to. When we do that, life tends to open up for us and become a little bit more life enhancing. And that's what we really want in terms of rebirth or regrowth or healing from our traumas. But here's the last thing that I really need you to know about grief and loss with respect to that is the sort of the grief part kind of comes with us forever. Last weekend, I think I talked about it in terms of it's a scar, right? And so scars come with us forever on our body, but scars actually do us a big favor, right? They help us heal. What we don't want is a scab that you keep reopening, right? And so the grief and loss comes with us, but it's a really small wedge. Like if you were to look at this stuff on a pie, it's a really small wedge of grief and loss, whereas there's a huge wedge of life enhancement, and there's an even bigger wedge of surviving and thriving, right? Okay, and of course, we want to normalize all those stages. Your job as you deal with your own grief and losses is to mobilize a response to take care of yourself through that and actually be an architect of life enhancement with that positive narrative, etc. Well, okay, that's, and then the last sort of review piece is the things that give us hope, right? Anyone recall what those hope pieces were? Please feel free to type in 3 things that give us a sense of hope. First one was values, having a set of personal values to live by, values to run your family by, values to work with your clients with, like a personal set of values. Yes, purpose and meaning. That's the second thing that gives us hope, having a deep sense of purpose and meaning. And I think one of the things that helps us certainly come out of hypervigilance is, and we're going to talk about this in a second, is self-care, and there's a bunch of self-care strategies, but having a routine and having purpose and meaning and that kind of stuff tends to kickstart us into the flow of life a little bit, into the rhythm of life, or what I call the current of life. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. Purpose and meaning, connecting with community, and I had mentioned values. So those are the 3 things that give us hope. Now, I noticed in one of the things that Donna had mentioned in terms of triggers that she felt her staff were having was a feeling of like isolation and loneliness. And so, and those are, I wasn't going to say expected, but I guess they're going to come with social isolation and quarantining, and those things are triggering because we're wired for connection, people. We are wired to connect with other human beings. It's funny, at the early part of this COVID experience, 8, 9, 10 weeks ago, My introverted clients were very vocal. Oh, I love this self-isolation. It's no problem whatsoever, right? And but those same clients now, 8, 10 weeks in, they're like, okay, I'm ready for my people now, right? And so even the most introverted people, I think at some stage realize they need to connect with their community. And I think you never really saw a lone cave woman or caveman, did you? They were always with their tribe. They were tribal in nature. They needed each other. They needed each other to find food, to move camp, to protect the children, whatever it was. And so this is in our DNA to connect with other humans, even if you're profoundly introverted. And as I mentioned briefly earlier today, super briefly I mentioned it, but one of the most healing things we can do is connect with another human being. So yeah, those social isolation triggers are going to be a big deal. My recommendation for that throughout this has been, and some people are commenting, we're getting too comfortable being at home. Yeah, I'm feeling like that too. But I'll tell you, maybe this is too much information, but there's been a couple of times actually before my Zoom was really live, but I was seeing clients just on the phone, and it's like Greg in his pajamas all day long, right? Getting a little bit too comfortable. And but I realized that that was hurting my mood a little bit. I needed the routine. I needed the shower, the shave, the put a button-down shirt on. Actually, I'm not wearing one today. Forgive me. But I'm not wearing my jammies, just so you know. And so that routine kickstarted me into the current of life. So I invite you to find ways of doing that if you're feeling isolated, if you're feeling, alone, is find ways to create routine in your life that kickstarts you into the current of life. And maybe that's reaching out to a loved one. One of the things I know about friendships is they require a two-way investment. And maybe there's a friend who's called you through these COVIDian times, and that was quite a thoughtful gesture. That was quite a bit of outreach, or quite a bit of what I would call a bid for connection. And so that felt good probably. And I would invite you to do the same, either with that same friend or pick a new one, right? And so when I talk about self-care through these times, I actually have one of my little challenges for people is to reach out to one loved one or one old friend per day. And it doesn't mean you need to be reaching out to scads of friends that you haven't talked to in a million years, but you might pick a couple of them that you really want to take the time to reach out to. I know there's been a handful of those people in my own life through this COVID times that have reached out to me, a really thoughtful gesture, and it did pick me up. And so I've made a point of reaching back out to them in a genuine way too. Maybe that isolation and aloneness also triggers us because we were kind of curious about maybe not being so introverted. And so maybe there's some identity shift happening. And maybe that's one of the takeaways of COVID as well. And that's that, we have all kinds of identities. These are structures that are operating in the background unconsciously that kind of act as a scaffold or a foundation propping us up. And remember that story I told you when I was introducing myself of, Greg on the chairlift, and I skied down the mountain and registered for school, and, and I was investing in who I was going to be kind of next. What I was investing in actually was a new identity. And I think as we age, we're constantly going through different stages of life, right? And so maybe there's a transition going on for some people from that extroversion, from that introversion to becoming a little bit more extroverted, okay? The other piece about this aloneness that I want to talk about is existentialism. So aloneness is a human experience that we're all faced with. It doesn't matter if you're super extroverted and you have tons of friends and you're super engaged in community, you still deal with aloneness. Aloneness is one of the, I think, 5 existential realities that all human beings having to cope with, right? And I don't know if you want to dig into that too much more, but for me, this is maybe just my orientation or my philosophy around this is when existential things trigger me, like things around death or aloneness or responsibility or meaning. I tend to get busy wanting to hurry up and live, doing things that are the antithesis or the opposite of death, right? Oh, so when we look at aloneness, I would be personally wanting to do something that's the antithesis or opposite of aloneness, connecting with my people. I happen to be quite extroverted, although as I age, I find I'm really becoming a bit more introverted, quite a bit more introverted, but I still have my people, right? And one of the things I've been grieving is connecting with a couple of mates and going for a bike ride. And, I haven't done that for 2 months. And actually last week I did that. And it was an absolute joy. And that night I felt really alive, really elevated, happy, and my mood was up. And I firmly believe that had something to do with hanging out with some quality people who, feed me in some way. Not food, right? They feed me emotional connection. They feed me some sort of spiritual connection. Of course, we went for a ride, so that's Greg and his physical, piece. But I think for men in particular, connecting on a spiritual level and an emotional level with other men is really important. Funny, I'll tell you too, there's research on that. Guess what? Only 20% of men actually do that, right? So 80% of men actually really aren't too engaged with themselves emotionally or spiritually. And the good old 80-20 rule, so that thing's flipped for women, right? 80% of women tend to be really connected with their emotions, 20% aren't. So as I share this with you, whether you're, however you identify, kind of just tune in to where you fall there. So I tend to be in the 20%, right? Look what I do for work. And I'll some self-disclosure here. My wife happens to be in the minority as well. For women, she is like the dude in the relationship, you might say, but she doesn't go to those emotions, touchy-feely things. And so funny how opposites attract sometimes. And I firmly believe that that's because we kind of each need a little bit of something that the other has, right? So I need a little bit of, not being so emotional, perhaps. And she probably needs to be evoked a little bit of emotion out of her, right? Whoa, I got off track there. My apologies. But those existential triggers can tend to be quite triggering. And aloneness is one of the 4 or 5 existential triggers that we have. And if you're looking to do a little bit of a deep dive into this concept of existentialism, there's some great podcasts out there on that right now. There's one on the Tim Ferriss show. There's one on the CBC with Nala Ayed, that show Ideas. Go back about a month or so on Ideas on the CBC. There's a fabulous podcast on existentialism. There's a great one too on a podcast that's called The Happiness Lab. I really invite you to check out The Happiness Lab, Dr. Laurie Santos. It's a fabulous podcast. I share that one with clients all the time, and they rave about it. So it could be something that you share with your clients too. Okay, questions come in. So I'd like to get distracted here. We have about just a little more than 15 minutes left, and I have to run right at 3. Or even just 1 or 2 minutes before. So I'd like to entertain some of these questions, especially because they're near and dear to you guys, as opposed to me rattling on about, I don't know, something I did. So talking to a male friend about how males are, the benefits of males connecting with other males on an emotional level. Any tips or resources or strategies or suggestions? I take it that question means like any tips on how to get men to connect that way. Great question. A couple of years ago, there was a young male in Squamish, had a workshop, and I think he called it Coming Out of the Man Cave. Does anyone remember that? It was held down there at the hub down there in Squamish a couple of years ago. I was there, And it was really neat. It only happened once, but it was this great night. We had about 80 people out, and we were just trying to evoke men out of this proverbial man cave a little bit and connect with their different identities, their emotional selves a little bit. And I think we need more programs like that. And in fact, that gives me an idea for the Sea to Sky Healing Project that I mentioned earlier that I'm involved with. So I guess the first thing that jumps to mind, for men that way is use what I would call invitational language. Avoid judgments around projecting how their lack of emotional intelligence is triggering you, because that judgment would shut them down even more. So you want to use invitational language of curiosity, because it's about like kind of evoking, the squirrel out of its den, perhaps a little bit. It's about evoking some sense of connection to feelings, out of them. Now, often what we see with men is men tend to show, I don't know what to call it, but kind of power dominance or force or anger. Now, if I was to ask you, if I was to tell you there's a primary feeling behind that anger propping it up, what would you guess that feeling would be? So take a minute, maybe just answer that in your head or answer that in the chat line there. The primary feeling that would be propping that anger up is fear. So if, as you work with males or the men in your own lives, whether they're your partners or your kids, good, someone's nailed that with the answer there on the chat column. Yes, it's fear. It's fear. So if the men that you're working with or your perfect partners, if you catch them in a little snapshot of like control or some force of having some way of having power over, or like outright anger, your spidey senses should tell you that there's probably some degree of fear happening in the background. Okay. Yes, and there's a private comment coming in. It's a very astute comment, which is males often feel more comfortable being emotionally vulnerable in front of females, as opposed to other males. Because men sometimes act really poorly as bystanders with other males around, and I see that all the time with the men I work with. So there's a question about, do you know if there are any men's groups or other movements for men in the Sea to Sky? I don't off the top of my head. As I said, there was this sort of one-time event. It was called, Coming Out of the Man Cave, I think it was called. But you've given me a great idea as a component maybe to add to the Sea to Sky Healing Project. And man, I would love to, quite frankly, hang out with a bunch of dudes on an emotional level therapeutically with a concept like this just myself. So maybe it's a program idea. Maybe Sea to Sky brings me down there to do that. Hey, Donna, let's rub our hands together on that. Sorry, that was a bit of a plug. So back to the question around actually, no, I'm going to come back to that private comment about programs for men. I was involved in a really awesome program for a number of years at the North Shore Neighborhood House down in North Vancouver. And by the way, that's the youth center or the youth outreach. That's where I worked as a youth outreach worker 100 years ago. And I've done a lot of neat stuff with those guys. And I recently have done some work where they have a pregnant and parenting teen program. That program ran beautifully, by the way, an amazing program. That program ran for 18 years without a single program option for the dads. 18 years without a single program option for the dads. So I contacted them down there, and I pitched them basically a men's group with the young dads men's group. And we had like 18 dads show up, and it was young dads. I think we made it up to 26 years old, they could come. And we ran that program for 4 years. We didn't run it last year because there was a funding issue, but it was one of those things where if you build it, they will come. And I think there's lots more we could do for men in communities to help them manage that fear, help them find a different way to discharge it in a way that they can be connected, and the way they can get their needs met, right? While at the same time meeting the needs of their partners and their kids and the people in their lives. Okay. Okay, before we wrap up, certainly feel free to shoot any questions my way, but I really want to talk about some concepts related to self-care. The term self-care historically has kind of bugged me because it's so broad and elusive and hard to put your finger on. What the heck does self-care mean? And I'm, in the next 12 minutes, I'm not going to probably completely answer that or do it justice because it is a broad topic and it's a really complex one. But I believe that some self-care strategies are, first of all, around being body-oriented, being a real detective of tuning into what you notice in your body. Because as I said earlier, it's your body waving some sort of red flag telling you how to self-protect. And too often we ignore those red flags, right? And I'm guilty of that too. I mentioned, connecting with a loved one, doing that deliberately every day, or an old friend, or reaching out to somebody. There was a question earlier about the science behind mindfulness, and yes, it's been heavily studied that when we are mindful, and we don't have a lot of time for this, but I'll give you my quick crash course on the 3 tools that I use frequently and often with clients to help them settle their nervous system down. And why do we need to settle it? Of course, we've talked about this earlier, because of all that darn charge we're carrying. So when you're tuned into your nervous system and you're aware of the charge that you're carrying, those are the moments to use what I call mindful moments, to be mindful of how to take care of yourself. And so here's the 3 things to use. Number 1, grounding. So that's connecting your feet to the earth, noticing your bottom and your back and your neck supported by the chair you're sitting in, and just taking a moment to really ground. Again, some of my clients tell me, Greg, that's too hippy dippy for me, but it does work when you really take a minute to connect with the earth. And you could do that in an imagery kind of way. Let's say you're on the 2nd floor, it's through your socks and the feet and the walls and the floor and the foundation, right down to the dirt, right? So you can do that kind of stuff to just slow the brain down a little bit. And the brain science behind this is pretty cool, because what we're doing is we're shutting the front part of the brain off with mindfulness. And this is where all the what if only, should have, all that monkey mind stuff, that lives up here. If we had you hooked up to a brain science detector, all the activity would be prefrontal neocortex. When we get into some of these mindfulness strategies, the brainwave activity moves to the back part of the brain. This is when we can enter that relaxed alertness state. This is when there's cellular healing in the nervous system. This is when our brainwave activity goes into that theta mode when we're healing, right? On a cellular level. So grounding is the first one. The second one is belly breathing. Too many of us spend the bulk of our day breathing into the top third of our lungs. That's problematic. Number 1, because we're not oxygenated. When we're not oxygenated, our brain power is going like this, right? And that's also problematic because when we're not oxygenated and we're, I think it kickstarts us into that hyper vigilance when we're breathing in that upper airway, right? Because we're like looking for what's next to deal with, and so we're upper airway breathing. So so there's often some meditation groups out there that do some breathing workshops. There's many online. Essentially, a yogic belly breath is breathing for 4 or 5 seconds in, 4 or 5 seconds out. And really being deliberate about filling the belly, filling the side lung, I call it, and then filling lastly, the upper airway. Okay? So let's try it. Just everyone take a second to breathe 4 or 5 seconds in and 4 or 5 seconds out. And remember, deep into your belly first, side lung second, upper airway third. Two bits of magic happen when we do that. Number one, our heart rate lowers, right? It's called heart rate variability. Number two, that brainwave activity moves from that monkey mind into the back part of the brain where we feel relaxed and alert. And lastly, this will sound familiar to you because we talked about it today already. It's connecting with your senses, your sense of touch, your sense of taste, your sense of smell, your sense of hearing, and your sense of sight. Because when you're deliberate and purposeful about checking in with that, my hope is that your nervous system picks up, due to your surroundings, that you are safe and that you are worthy of love and belonging. Nothing's coming to eat you, right? So grounding, finding your breath, and sensory awareness. Those are the 3 strategies I'd give you. Maybe that's a great place to start to wrap up, because you all did that little belly breathing, and hopefully your little nervous systems out there are settled before you transition into your next realm of your existence. Now, your homework or my wish for you is that you make that transition in a grounded way, in a deliberate way, in a purposeful way. I don't want you to hang up from this call and then just go all of a sudden immediately hair on fire, pedal to the metal, because that is a form of hypervigilance too, right? Let's move slow, deliberately, and purposefully. Any last questions for me as we begin to wrap up? Okay, there is a question that I missed there. Going back to this fight, flight, and freeze concept, what are some ways to get unstuck in any of those? Ooh, we could do a whole hour and a half on that, my friends. But first of all, I think we all have our work to do. I know I couldn't do my job without having done a ton of work on myself, and I continue to do that. I see a therapist. I have to keep my professional designation, and I see a therapist for my own stuff. And so knowing your stuff and knowing historically why you get stuck in these habitual response patterns might be step number 1 there. And number 2 is finding alternative ways to react, knowing that, okay, I get stuck in freeze all the damn time. And I have my freeze clients, you guys. I have my, you people, I have my fight clients who are always fighting the power when things get stressful. And I have my freeze clients who are always running away when things get too hot in the kitchen, right? And so with those folks, I'm trying to get them to come up with another way of responding to the predicament they're faced with, right? Let's say they need to flee a little bit. Well, I might invite them to go for a brisk walk at night, right? Because if you ever have a client in your office who is tapping their feet or bouncing their knee up and down all the time, what latent self-protective response is hiding in the background? It's flight. They're like bursting to get out of my office, right? So the last part of that answer, and as I said, we could talk at length about that, would be to help them actuate or utilize a different response pattern, and then help them orient to that feeling of empowerment, right? Okay, everybody, I have to start to wrap up because I have another Zoomy place to be in 3 minutes. Once again, really grateful to spend some time with you today. I have another one of these sessions booked with you next week, 1:30, 28th, I do believe. Yes, the 28th of May, same time, same place. If you have any specific questions for me between now and then, please feel free to reach out to me via email or phone call, or through Donna. And I'm getting lots of thank yous here. Thank you all. I really appreciate you sticking around for an hour and a half. That's a good long time to be staring at the screen. I got to do another one after this. Woo!
Thanks, Greg. Much appreciated. Thanks, everybody, for for being here.
Okay, everybody, take good care out there, all right? Be safe, be well, and be safe. Take care of yourselves, all right? Bye now.